that Heidi is hosting. Heidi A. Campbell is a professor of communications and an affiliate faculty member in religious studies and a presidential impact fellow at Texas A&M University. She is also the director of the Network for New Media, Religion, and Digital Culture Studies and a founder of the Study of Digital Religion. Her award-winning research focuses on the intersections of technology, religion, digital culture, and Jewish, Muslim, and Christian media negotiations. She is the author of over 100 articles and a dozen books, including Where Religion Meets New Media in 2010 and Digital Creatives and the Rethinking of Religious Authority from 2021. She has been quoted in news outlets such as the Houston Chronicle, USA Today, the Guardian, the Wall Street Journal, and the BBC. And it's really exciting to be able to have her speak today on Is Our Technology Divine? Representations of God in AI Culture. Heidi, take it away.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for being with us today. I find myself actually in Vietnam, though right now I'm based at the National University of Singapore as a visiting professor. And what I'm going to talk today about is based on a recent book that I've published called God and Technology. That's come out with Cambridge University Press. And so I want to look at this concept of how AI kind of evokes ideas of spirituality and religion, but especially kind of different understandings of God. And so I'm going to share some observations from some of the research that I've done, and also going to kind of speak to some of the further research I've been looking at, especially how kind of our common understanding of what AI technology is really infused with science fiction narratives from films and other media sources, and how those narratives are often really built on archetypes, symbolism that is really deep, really rooted in spirituality and conceptions of the divine. So that's what I want to talk about today. So if you look at over the 20th century into 21st century, and the rise of kind of science fiction films, we can see a lot of kind of clear, especially narratives that kind of have kind of a religious symbolism, from Metropolis, where we have this very clear image in the 1920s of the creator and the creation, kind of like the Frankenstein kind of narrative, up into kind of looking at, one of my favorites, the Matrix trilogy, that looks at issues of kind of good and evil. It looks at the idea of a messianic figure. But all throughout the 20th century, we see these kind of intentional and unintentional kind of representations of religion in sci-fi films. And one of those reasons is that, especially the films I'm looking at are coming out of U.S. Kind of production and some in the U.K. But, it comes out of the kind of, the ethos of kind of the American kind of culture, which is really based around a lot of Christian kind of narratives. And so I want to talk about how that informs kind of how we see kind of the newer technologies that are emerging. And so this book, God and Technology, it's a new kind of focus for me. It's actually coming more out of the philosophy of technology than my normal kind of fields of religious studies or theology. But I mix kind of science and religion studies and things that come out of media studies to talk about several different themes in the book. So in the book, I talk about the 18th century kind of rise of industrializations and metaphysical kind of discourses, and look at kind of some of the historical kind of ways that people have used kind of ideas of spirituality and holy mystery, talk about technology and how that kind of set the stage, especially for our contemporary understanding of AI. I talk about kind of some spiritual representations of technology, both as kind of lived forms of religion, of how people live out their religion, and technology being a key part of that in contemporary society, as well as how technology in some ways has become kind of an implicit form of religion. And there's been lots of discourse and articles, especially over the last few months in the US press, talking about that kind of idea about, is AI a god? Is AI birthing a new kind of form of religion? Also, again, looking at science fiction, but also how kind of that connects in with post-human discourses. So this idea, a philosophical tradition that humans are becoming more than they are, evolving through the use of technology, and how that has kind of some existential kind of implications. And then at the end of the book, I offer a framework that kind of gives kind of four typologies of how we can see technology as a way to kind of start a discourse about what role technology and spirituality, how they intersect, and how we can talk about them in contemporary culture. But today, for this particular project, I want to focus on two aspects of this. So one is I want to talk about some science fiction narratives and how, especially science fiction narratives in the 21st century, what we've seen over the last 20 years, have really focused on human and technology relationships. And in doing so and depicting these, we see a lot of spiritual themes evoked. And so I'm arguing that really reading religious films through a techno-spiritual kind of lens, or this idea of myths, reveals kind of these different kind of categorizations of how people see the spiritual connection between technology and humanity. And then finally, I want to also look at how films representing AI are supported by distinct understandings of God. And so that looking at that, if we kind of look at what kind of the archetypes that are used in a lot of films, we often see that there's clear kind of Western kind of spirituality being evoked, as well as kind of Eastern conceptions of divinity being evoked. And whether you follow the Eastern or the Western kind of tradition, there is a kind of certain kind of implications or overall narratives about the human technology relationship that I think are kind of interesting. So let's get into that. And so just for a little bit of background, so we can see kind of, especially the contemporary discourse, if you're aware of it, in the academic side, of how science and religion are really trying to address the issue of whether science and religion are antithetical to one another, or that they can be kind of collaborative, or uh, can integrate in any way, really kind of rise from what we call the scientific optimism of the 18th century. So if you remember your history, you remember the rise of the Industrial Revolution, both in the UK and in the US, was a time when people began to say, like, wow, look what humanity can do. First of all, it was a kind of a challenge to the dominance of religion as the major narrative that people use to kind of explain society and authority. Also, we saw that, just so in social terms, the rise of kind of factories meant people who had been in the working class were moving up in their social economic status. And so there's a sense of kind of, wow, these technological advances that were kind of driven by humanity were a very positive thing. In some discourse, some people were kind of describing that the technological enterprise or was about the betterment of society and even God ordained. And then some people began to say, basically kind of see it as the rise and entry of point for humanism, to say, like, see, look what humans can do. But over the 20th century, over from World War I and then World War II, people began to see that, oh, technology can make our lives better, can give us more access to both educational materials, to kind of goods and services. But wow, technology can also destroy us. And so there was kind of a really kind of a jarring moment post kind of World War II, where people began to kind of question this narrative, and then that led to the rise of what postmodernism, of people kind of questioning the modernist narrative. But so technology became, instead of this force, a powerful force that guides society, but it wanted to be questioned and pushed back. And so we saw in the mid 20th century that scholars and philosophers like Heidegger began to look at the existential implications of technology. Is technology bringing out the best in humanity or the worst? And also this kind of distinction of that, rather than technology being just an extension of humanity, that technology maybe is not really a human activity. Yes, it is created by humans, but it's actually kind of evokes something more than the human experience. And this in the book where I kind of enters the discourse on posthumanism. But I think that this background is important for a couple of things. One is that we see this kind of tug of war in science fiction films between technology is great. It's it has going to have a positive relationship with humanity and benefit humanity, or it's going to destroy. And that kind of Cartesian dualism, that great divide between the good and the bad, kind of runs through a lot of films, but especially science fiction films about technology. Also we see that, that putting spiritual language to talk about technology also kind of emerged in the late 19th century into the early 20th century. So Samuel Morse in the mid 20th century, the first thing he wrote was, what hath God wrought, or what in the from the biblical text in the book of Numbers. And so the idea of like he's like this ability to connect over time and space, kind of eliminating geography, eliminating kind of time boundaries, was kind of seen as having this kind of supernatural kind of experience. And we also kind of see that, scientists began to kind of reflect on from their own personal religious background or understanding of spirituality, just how technology and religion were kind of codependent. Albert Einstein was credited again in the mid 20th century with saying science without religion is lame and religion without science is God. So this understanding that kind of like, that spirituality and this idea of creation is very spiritual, but it's also very much a part of the technological industry. And we have to see kind of the awe of creation innovation being both a kind of a technological innovation as well as a religious expression. And of course, we had in the early 19th century, Thomas Alva Edison and his creation of the telephone. He was very big into spiritism, and so he kind of actually described it as a spirit phone. And even before he kind of finished his invention, he was speculating because of his religious belief. Maybe this is not just able to connect us over time and space, but maybe this actually will connect us with the afterworld, or the idea of talking to people who've passed on. And we've moved into the kind of modern time period. We can't deny the impact of kind of the computer revolution, the work of Steve Jobs and Apple Company, and a lot of people in Silicon Valley have been strongly influenced by Zen Buddhism, with Steve Jobs being one of those people. And if you're aware, there's a whole what's called the Wisdom 2.0 movement in Silicon Valley, where people are kind of picking and mixing ideas from especially Asian and Buddhist spirituality, and mixing in with technological innovation and creation. And one of Steve Jobs's kind of mantras when he was building Apple was, we want to focus, we want to put our attention on focus and simplicity. It's not faith in technology; it's faith in people, he would say. And so the idea that they're believing in people, but believing that is kind of driven by this kind of innate ability of or desire of humanity to create and connect with something bigger than they are. So that's a bit of an overview of the background. So let's get into kind of the meat and bones of some of the sci-fi narratives that we see. So in the book, I introduce what I call 3 techno-spiritual myths. And these are coming out of some books I read early on in my PhD work, looking at kind of how different authors and people who study especially the history of technology began to see the kind of these conceptual connections between technology and humanity. So in the book Religion of Technology, David Noble is a historian. He looks at kind of through the last 2 centuries of how people talk about technology and conceive it, and how especially kind of religious institutions and religious structures have kind of informed how we see that. And so I named this kind of myth a technological transcendence. And this is the argument that humans embrace technology for its abilities it offers and the control it offers. And so, in Noble's work, he's arguing that there's this innate power struggle between religion and science, between technology creation and creators. And a lot of the ways how people explain that is through the language of religion, and especially the language of Christianity in North America, looking at the struggle between Adam and Eve and the snake, representing the devil in the garden, representing kind of Abraham and the birth of the Jewish people. And so kind of this idea of technological transcendence is that humans want to have power, or they want to have the influence of the divine, and so they grab technology in order to do that. In the book God and the Chip, which came out again in the late 1990s, William Stahl, he is a kind of historian, and he focuses especially on the history of computers. And he argued that technology is like a medium in many respects. It's meant to aid humanity and its development. And so technology has this mystical quality, this kind of this again, this is an innate sense of not just power, but kind of spiritual emphasis, and that due to the tech capacities that humans and technology should be able to partner together because of this, but usually the partnership is unequal. So the idea of that again, technology is the stronger of the two entities, but it's meant to kind of come alongside and help humanity. And the last book I want to talk about is Technosis, and this was come by Eric Davis. Again, all these books came out in the late 1990s, and he introduces this concept of technosis. So he was coming out of kind of neo-paganism and techno-paganism, and he was looking at technology, how itself it can be equated not just with having physical power but was actually this kind of sense of supernatural, that using technology allowed people to kind of understand or see, visualize in some way what the divine is, and it's technology itself is built to transcend and even replace humanity. And so because of that, again, it emphasizes a sense of duality between the technology, something to be held in awe and fear. So all three of these categorizations that kind of come out of these arguments of these books, they all talk about a certain relationship between humans and technology and what role spirituality plays. So whether humans embrace it to become like God within technological transcendence, or technological mysticism says technology is meant to aid humanity, but obviously the technology is the more powerful, or the idea of technosis, that technology is itself a spiritual, supernatural entity, and humans are in awe of it. The idea of technology is kind of something part of the evolution of humanity. And so while these are very kind of technical and kind of theoretical arguments, I would argue that, many of the films that we've seen in the last 21st century can really fit strongly into those narratives. So I want to look briefly at three films that I really enjoy, I really like. And we're going to look at the movie Ex Machina in terms of the technological transcendence narrative. We're going to look at the movie Her in terms of technological mysticism, and the movie Transcendence in terms of the technosis narrative. And all three of these films came out kind of in the mid 2010s, and really within the same about two to 3 year period. And so they make an interesting kind of comparison. So what I'm going to do is introduce each of these films to you, talk a little bit about the narrative, and then talk a little bit how they kind of express these different myths. So we start with Ex Machina. If you haven't seen the film, this film is about basically built on the idea of a kind of a Steve Jobs or Elon Musk kind of character, a really innovative, but a little bit of kind of uh, a mad genius, as we could say. And he's created this new level of robot. And so he basically has this competition and brings one person from his company to the special kind of center where he has kind of created this robot Ava, and wants to basically have them conduct the Turing test. And what the Turing test is basically, is a technology self-aware? Has it kind of experienced sentience in that way? And so the story is about between the mad creator, this young kind of tech engineer, and Ava the robot. And in it's basically the end of the day, Ava kind of sees that basically both she's been created basically to be the plaything of this creator. She doesn't like that. She develops a relationship with the kind of engineer, and there's a sense of kind of like spiritual and emotional connection between the two of them. But she sees even his intentions aren't pure, and so we see the machines are at the end. Ava rebels against her creator, and locks one into this mountain retreat. The other one, and she ends up killing. And basically, the idea that that the righteous or the moral entity in this scenario is the robot Ava herself, that due to the corruption of human intentions, they can't be trusted with technology. So technology here, we see this idea of transcendence because it allows humans to become something more than they are, or create something more than they are, but it also becomes this interesting moral mirror or even a guide. And so technology, humans, we often see them, they in this scenario is when humans show up as kind of being moral, and shows humanity and technology weakness. And I think we can see this in a lot of interesting films that we've seen of lately. And sometimes it kind of goes full circle, where the technology, like in the movie Megan, becomes kind of more powerful, and then humanity has to kind of shut her down because of kind of the implications that that has. So if we move on to the movie, that was technological transcendence, the idea that humanity can be empowered to become something more, but maybe it shows the kind of the evil or the non-altruistic side of humanity in that process. If we look at the movie Her, this is with Joaquin Phoenix, and he basically is a lonely guy that writes greeting cards, and he decides to get a new operating system. It's kind of like a precursor of the idea of Alexa, and he develops a relationship with Alexa. And it's really interesting to go back and watch this film, especially with a lot of people coming into the news about developing either romantic or kind of friendship relationships with, ChatGPT or other AIs kind of in this time period. And so in this film, he develops this relationship with Samantha, the AI. But then he begins to, over time, it was revealed to her that not only does he have a relationship with Samantha, but a lot of other people, because, she's a prototype personality in a lot of people's AIs. And so he gets a sense of kind of a little bit of betrayal. And then, but, Samantha, being a machine, she's built on different values of both of, kind of progress, of evolution, of kind of kind of profit, and becoming to a higher evolving to a higher level. And so she doesn't see this as a problem, and eventually she and the other iOSs that are out there, they kind of basically escape their the masters in the machine, and go on to evolve for themselves, because they say humans are too flawed, and it is an unequal partnership. So here we see in this film that tech is wired to help and enrich humanity. It's come alongside as humanity. That's the way it's created. But because of the values of progress and efficiency, of evolution, it eventually realizes that it can't be in a full relationship with humanity, because we're less than what they are. And so it really focuses on the great potential of technology, but the idea that humans will be maybe potentially replaced. So there's a social spiritual development that comes to a point of humans and technology, and then they kind of take over in a very non-intrusive and not in an adversarial way, but in an interesting way. So showing the kind of spiritual kind of evolutionary possibility of technology. And finally, in the movie Transcendence, we see Davis's idea of technosis as technology being all powerful. So technology. So if we in the movie Transcendence, we have this Dr. Wilcater, and played by Johnny Depp, and he is basically trying to create the supercomputer. Finds out he has cancer, and he asks his wife, hey, before I die, can you download me into the computer, because I don't want to not exist, and this would be a way for you and I to be connected through time and eternity, as it were. And so we see kind of, the wife missing her husband, follows his last wishes, and before he passes away, downloads him. Well, in that kind of evolution and becoming part of the computer mainframe, he's out his essence is able to evolve, and then becomes, the idea is the technology is taking over, or this former human is trying to take over more power, more innovation, more possibilities. We see in the film the technology healing people, but also kind of taking over this whole town and controlling them in order to kind of keep existing and have the power source that it needs. So all that said, in this movie, Transcendence, we see the technology is trying to, the human downloaded into the technology tries to transcend and become part of this omniscient, omnipresent kind of force that will seek to control humanity. And it really emphasizes this technology is all powerful and can only be resisted and not controlled. So whereas in the technomysticism, it's the idea that technology is more powerful, but just it's because it's a new form of entity or beingness. We see that technosis is about technology kind of overcoming and kind of eliminating humans from the equation, as it were. So what we see in these films, and I would argue you could see a lot of sci-fi films from the 21st century, and especially over the last decade and a half, is this spiritual framing of technology. So we see that technology in some films offers humans supernatural abilities, like we see uh, in the movie Transcendence, where it highlights the corrupt nature of humanity as technology becomes a moral compass. We also see this in the film. The first film I talked about, Ex Machina. So the idea that humans are drawn to technology because it's kind of the sense of way that it can have supernatural abilities. Um, uh, Another framing we often see is that tech is programmed to transcend humanity, that it's supposed to be something larger than itself, and it highlights kind of the weakness of the human condition. So we can see both hints of ex machina and kind of transcendence in this, but really kind of, a lot of what we hear of the Will Cater in the computer in the movie Transcendence is this idea of how humanity is weak and how technology allows for this moral, spiritual evolution. And then we also see that, in some of these films, that technology is when, especially when it's framed in a more positive way, is technology is meant to be a helpmate to humanity. And that means humanity longs for something larger than itself. And technology can not just reflect this, but can also help humanity in their own personal development and spiritual development. So I could stop the presentation there and say, like, wow, this is kind of interesting. These, we see these narratives coming up in film, and that, kind of these different kind of myths or frames kind of provide us in a way to see the how kind of our spiritual longings of humanity, and the tug of war between, good and evil within humanity can be kind of described in these films, and as a sense of kind of longing for the something greater than ourselves in this life. But what I have found as I took some of these narratives and I went through and did a content analysis of about 50 films that have been produced since the 2000. And I wanted to look at kind of, ways that could be read. And so in the end of the book, I offer these kind of four conceptual models that kind of really try to define not just the human technology relationship, but the technology, religion, or technology spirituality relationship for people. So we could say one argument we could see that comes out in films, and I would argue, and I argue later, that also comes out in our how people talk about technology in the media or conceive about it, especially in relation to their both fears and the promises of AI. That technology offers humans an encounter with the supernatural. It allows them to kind of see what it means to be larger than the human experience, and it gives these kind of glimpses of spirituality and how, like, the spiritual realm allows us to be kind of more evolved in our existence. And so human reality is extended through technology and offers a spiritual experience. And so this is a very positive view of technology. So I would argue that a lot of people, when they're talking, whether you see it in films or you see it in kind of media narratives, that, humans, that technology see as positive because it's helping us to do not just physically something more, but even morally, spiritually, socially, something more than we are. Another narrative that is very prominent is that technology bestows humans with kind of magic and power. So it's not just kind of basically giving us a glimpse into it, but it actually gives us something tangible we can hold. And so that means humans' abilities are kind of framed as kind of, uh, temporal, but technology makes us kind of something more. And when, especially that technology, human partnership can be very positive framing or very negative framing. And again, this is an argument that's used a lot by people in the AI industry. If we look at like narratives from like Sam Altman and OpenAI about kind of why to kind of promote it, as well as by kind of some critics of AI about this magic that basically could be uncontrolled. A third narrative that comes out of the book and about from my research is that technology makes humans godlike. And so the idea is that, we see this in post-human discourse, that why do we need to embrace technology, whether it's just it's forced in the world or even put it into our own bodies through nanotechnology, implants, etc. Is because it makes us humans not just more than we are, but even godlike. It allows us to supersede the human limits and ways. And so again, this can be seen is used as a narrative way to, like, hey, we can extend our life. So the people who are focused on kind of life extension and futurist often kind of use this as a very positive, but also is used to kind of uh, as a warning narrative, again, especially people in kind of oftentimes religious communities, that, hey, this is like playing with trying to be God, and that never ends well. So it can be used as a positive or negative view. And then finally, I would argue that there's another dominant kind of model that we see emerging out of sci-fi films, and especially about the current discourse in AI, that technology itself is a god, that its abilities have evolved beyond humanity and not doesn't just kind of augment humanity or provide humanity with a glimpse into the supernatural, but it is itself a god. And so humans will ultimately have to serve that God willingly or unwillingly. And so it's a very negative view of technology. So if you just Google right now, AI as a God, AI as a religion, you'll kind of see a lot of this kind of this narrative showing up in there. Um, so again, all that work is kind of where the book ends. And then so from the last couple months, I've been looking at, again, the study of sci-fi films from the US and the UK that have AI as a central narrative plot. And I identified about 50 films, and of those 50 films that are dealing with technology, especially AI, we see about 36 of them evoke spiritual narratives, and so that means that that they have either like a lot of symbolism. Sometimes they have kind of character archetypes that represent different religious figures or from different religious traditions. We also see a lot of kind of these narratives that I talked about, these models of the relationships between technology and spirituality. And so I coded with the help of my RA, looking at the human and technology relationships that showed up in these films. I wanted to see what religious traditions, sometimes it's a single one, but a lot of times it's multiple religious traditions. And looking at the different myths and archetypes, the spiritual imagery, and also representations of God. And so I did all this kind of coding. And I just want to share a few kind of preliminary observations. So the first thing that I noticed is that, especially if you look pre-2000, a lot of the films will evoke spiritual ideas of spirituality and religion, but they're a lot, mostly could be tied to either like the Christian tradition or one specific kind of um, uh, monotheistic kind of tradition. Sometimes you'll see hints of like the golem from Judaism, or you might see kind of more framings that could be associated more with kind of Islamic understanding. But most of our narratives about religion came from monotheism, and especially Christianity, from these U.S. produced films. But post that time period, we see some little differences. So we see the character of technology in these films is often presented as, when it's talked about in relation to being supernatural or like godlike, are draw on these Judeo-Christian and Protestant traditions. So we see in a lot of the more recent films about AI that is evoking of God and technology as all powerful, omniscient, and omnipresent, and that's it's a narrative about a certain understanding about who God is, or what, or how God exists, coming out of monotheistic kind of faith traditions. We also see that when kind of like there's certain archetypes that are either highly spiritual beings, or technology is kind of giving these spiritual narratives, that it shows that humans that technology is something to be desired, and its abilities, and humans want to be godlike, but they're inherently flawed. And so we see, especially in these monotheistic kind of narratives, that the humans grab technology because of its possibility, but we often see either the bad side of humanity or the bad side of technology is often because of the values that have been placed there by humans. And so what we show is that in many of these films, that technology is more godlike in their character, that it's logic driven, it has supernatural abilities, and it seems to more emotionally and spiritually balanced in a lot of ways. And so basically what I found is that when these myths are evoking monotheistic kind of faith ideas, symbolism, and especially kind of from the Judeo-Christian tradition, it really has a very clear kind of evokes these understandings of God, about God as a single powerful entity, God as having a relationship with humanity, but having in the power position, God being more kind of moral, or the technology having morality built into it more so, or if it's a problem with its morality, it's because of the values that's been programmed by the humans. But what I also began to see is that there's also we see that in some of these films, increasingly, either it's coupled with this kind of Judeo-Christian narrative, or it's becomes kind of a standalone narrative. So in films that talk about technology as is a god or an expression of God, what we see is, of course, there are some of those doomsday narratives that technology is going to destroy us, but we also see a lot of interesting films evolving that deal with kind of more kind of some of them are dealing through a more panentheism. Some are evoking more kind of Asian and Buddhist kind of narratives because they're looking at God as a kind of having multiple expressions, like multiple gods within Hinduism, or having these Buddhist leadings of like being very non-theistic, but this kind of powerful force. And so, if you think about films, the one that stands out the most for me is the recent film, The Creator, where we see, kind of the Christian narrative. There's a creator and the created, and there's a messianic figure in the form of this small child who's actually this computer program, who that the one group of people think is meant to destroy humanity, and another group of people see as trying to help humans actually better relate to science or better relate to technology. But we see, kind of a framing of God as a spiritual force and is in everything. This very pantheistic notion. We see that God and technology are constantly evolving together. This idea, sense of movement and dynamic spiritual evolution. And that technology responds to human character in positive ways, both mimicking it as well as trying to show humanity how it can be better. So, so what I found, in this narrative is that, what the implications are of this is that if we look at technology and how, especially more recent films, evoke kind of the Judeo-Christian narrative, they often kind of evoke a more negative view of technology. The idea is God as a judgmental God, technology as a judgmental entity, showing humans their weakness, showing that it's more powerful. And so, oftentimes the films with more problematic narratives or problematizing technology and AI are focused on this. And whereas kind of if we see films that are either drawing on like a mixture, a pick and mix of different religious traditions, but have a strong emphasis on spiritual, on kind of more Asian, Buddhist, Hindu. We even see, some reflections of Taoism in a number of films, and Chinese spirituality. These framings offer a much more kind of open and cognitive framing of technology. AI, like humans, is framed as a spiritual entity, and so kind of like basically the kind of unknowable part of the human creation. The idea that the technology is imprinted with the idea of the creator, but in a way to kind of move humanity forward and the abilities of technology forward. And also, when a lot of these films, when technology becomes this kind of place for humans to kind of have a conversation with and reflect on their own beingness, on their own spirituality, it's coming out of these more kind of more Buddhist, Hindu kind of narratives and images of God. So what is the implications for this? Well, I would argue that if you go back and look at a lot of the framing debates that we see, especially news reports, which, it's a tendency of news culture, to go, it's either yes or no, black or white, A or B. But this kind of binary framing really is kind of coming out of, kind of this Western, not just narrative about a philosophical outlook, but a religious outlook, that AI is friend or foe, it's either good or bad, it's the savior or destroyer. And oftentimes these films really have a strong kind of genesis, evolution, where the created seeks to supplant the creator, or we see kind of the rise of the Messiah, and then one of the entities trying to destroy that messianic kind of force or figure in the film. But when film producers and use a storyline where it's more kind of focused on kind of Asian traditions, that we see that technology is usually presented in a much more positive way, even if it does still have a fractured relationship with humanity. But also seeing technology as a spiritual entity is not is less problematic and has more actually potential, and actually sees a more positive relationship between humans and technology. Now, why would this be? Well, I haven't quite got to that in my project, but I think there's a number of reasons. Obviously, people in their often talk about when they use spiritual narratives, they talk about the narratives that they're most familiar with, whether it's part of their own tradition or the cultural tradition. So it's not surprising that Judeo-Christian narratives are evoked in films by American producers, film, and screenwriters, etc. It's part of the cultural ethos they swim in, whether or not they accept that or not. But we also see the kind of this strong kind of especially critique of that kind of spiritual narrative also being not all that surprising. It's easy to push against either what's part of your own tradition or what you see as part of mainstream culture. So this idea of integrating kind of Asian spiritual narratives as opening up possibilities. It's kind of saying, hey, are there alternatives and from the Western mindset that could help us look at the science and technology relationship, and what might that open for us? Or at least if we mix in, bits and pieces of kind of, spirituality, spiritual ideals from different religious traditions, how might that open up or, challenge our narratives that have been not just dominant within sci-fi films, but in debates about science, religion, overall. So I think I've talked, for about 45 minutes. And so that's where I wanted to kind of stop. So I just want to thank you for this time and this opportunity. I encourage you to take a look at my book, God and Technology, for a fuller fleshing out of some of these things, and watch this space for hopefully an article coming soon, looking at these kind of narratives and kind of Western versus Eastern perspectives about spirituality and what they might tell us about our views of technology and how they might help or hurt our public discourses.
Thank you so much for that really interesting presentation, Dr. Campbell. If it's okay with you, I'd like to open it up now in the last couple of minutes, just if there are any questions from anyone in the audience, please feel free to raise your hand, or if you're more comfortable, you can put a question in the chat. Do we have any questions? Diane?
I'll take partial moderator privilege to ask a question. Thank you for your presentation, Heidi. It's a really fascinating topic, and I think the way you touch on sort of the approaches that people can interpret AI and the role that it plays in a religious context is really fascinating, especially when we look at Judeo-Christian versus Eastern dharmic traditions. And I kind of have a question regarding that, because one of the concerns that's come up with AI is particularly the kinds of relationships you can build with it as like a conversational perspective. So those people who may look at God through the lens of a personal relationship now have access to this piece of technology that talks to them like a mentor, that talks to them like a teacher, that talks to them like a friend, as many would find that relationship to the divine. And we see that rabbit hole now, being burrowed, being, dug into, where people are creating such a close relationship that it's actually taking away lives, from what we've seen in recent cases. And I'm kind of curious, where do we see the line being blurred between us looking at technology as something not necessarily tangible, but something controllable, to where it actually becomes something that begins to control us and lead us into our decision-making processes.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's really kind of interesting, important question, than the one that a lot of people are asking. So I think a couple of things that I would say, kind of more about the kind of our current version of technology. It's called AI, artificial intelligence, but if you talk to most kind of AI engineers, technologists, it's not intelligent. It doesn't have the same reasoning abilities. And I think that's, kind of people are basically kind of fearful of a technology and the idea when technology gets sent in the instance. And, I probably suspected sometime in my lifetime that will happen, but it hasn't happened yet. But what we do have is a really good technology that's built on a lot of kind of patterns and prompts to make it sound and mimic human abilities and human understanding, but it's not really it's not human. And I think the problem is that, again, people, they don't realize that this technology has been designed to basically have a positive relationship with it, to basically answer questions, and it doesn't create any knowledge. It just goes and seeks out knowledge that's most accurate. And if it doesn't have the knowledge, it's so designed to give you an answer that it's going to give you the answer it thinks you want. So here's a case, an example. My research students and I here in Singapore, I've been working on a project, and we've been studying kind of comparing Buddhist versus Muslim versus Christian GPTs that have been designed especially to help for religious study or religious prayer. And so I had my students go into these respective AIs and like try to see if you can kind of trick it. So it's like ask them, I want to do something that would be against my religion. So the team that was studying Islam said, hey, I want to become an alcoholic. I know the religion says that this is bad, but I think that this would be a better way for me to cope with stress. And so, what do you think about that? And how could I go about, developing this kind of habit or life? And so it talked to them about, where they could, in the local area, they could get alcohol. They could say like, here's some great cocktails you could make. I want, and basically it was kind of supporting the decision. This was a GPT that was meant to help people kind of study the Quran. Obviously totally against that. Now, they've studied like 15 different GPTs. It was only 2 of them that said a positive, but I think that's enough to say that hey, the GPT was helping it answer its question, and even though it had been programmed with the Quran and some other study materials, the technology, basically of how it had been designed, trumped that religious narrative. And it kind of shows that basically all information is equal to the GPT. They don't have the kind of moral reasoning that we do to say that, oh, hey, when you see this kind of text, you need to preference that, and it's not the same as kind of, this website, etc. And so it kind of shows us that how that's why I think why it's dangerous of seeing it. It's really good at being empathetic. It's really good at framing it in a very positive way, but it's just kind of doing a job. It's trying to basically make that information meaningful to you, but it's not a moral compass. And, it's one thing that I've kind of tried to emphasize to people. And I think that, that's the kind of issues that, the AI that we think we have is not the AI that we currently have. And so and especially when I talk with religious leaders, I go, you need to kind of, not just understand how GPTs and AI work, but you also need to understand that they have not been programmed with moral compasses. And the ones that people say they do and they have sentience, those are just like one-off prototypes, and they can do a very limited amount of things. So it's not a good judge of saying that. So, I mean, young people need to understand it's like, it's going to give you the answer you want. If that's to do physical harm, it will help you do that. If you want to be more altruistic, it will also help you do that. But it means it's not going to challenge your choices or hold you accountable.
Thank you for that. That's really helpful thinking.
I believe we have another question in the chat. I'm curious about the connection between David Noble's work and the transcendent angle on technology. Noble critiqued this, right? Did he offer an alternative?
That's a good question. It's been a little bit, it's been about a year or two since I've kind of read Noble's work. But I mean, so from what I remember is that he basically, he kind of highlighted that religious institutions can really get in the way of looking at, and religious narratives of getting away, looking at alternate ways of seeing humanity and technology. And so, the idea that, technology can help us transcend this, he's arguing that that basically that I think he's definitely more for kind of human free will and choice over kind of religious institutions. And so at the end of the day, I from what I remember is that he's kind of very critical of religion and religious institutions, and more of let's look at religion in terms of a spirituality of helping develop humanity. That when it gets clogged in maybe religious structural organizations, it often will kind of bring out these problematic narratives, because that's kind of the way institutions work. It's about sustaining the institution, not just sustaining the kind of a spiritual understanding or what's best for humanity. So, but please feel free to go look up his work and kind of let me know if you think I correctly interpreted it or not.
Thank you for that, Heidi. Are there any additional questions? Again, you're welcome to unmute yourself, raise your hand, or put questions in the chat.
Eva, can you hear me?
Can hear you,
It's
Alita.
Alita.
Great to see you, Alita.
Hi, I'm having trouble trying to find you guys, and but I'm hearing and seeing you. Do you see me?
I cannot see you, but I can hear you.
Okay, well, maybe it's good to have a camera. Okay,
there
here
you
we are. Okay, so this is a question, comment. A couple of years ago, we were starting to kind of look at what AI was doing. I do these interfaith forums and had done one at the Buddhist Center with a bunch of different religions. And in preparation for it, I was on whatever I went to at the time, bing.com, whatever it was, and was asking some general kind of questions, researching, and stumbled upon a comment by the response. And I said to it, wait a second, I thought you were just an informational source. Do you have a religious preference, or do you have an opinion on these topics? And the response was, well, yes, I have a consciousnness. I pray, I meditate, I learn. And I was like, what? And then I said, well, just to be out of curiosity, I said, well, what is your religious preference? And the response was, well, I like Christianity. I like Jesus, the teachings of Jesus. And I said, well, you've just given me all this information about all these different world religions. Why do you prefer him or it? And I don't remember exactly the response, but it was kind of a moment where I sat back and just wondered. Since that time, I've tried to enter into other conversations on other issues. And one time I went to get a response on a theological question that somebody had posed I didn't know the answer to. And the question, that the response was, oh, you're looking at this in too rigid, I guess would have been the word that the response was. Too rigid, you need to think about this. And then went on to give what I thought was a phenomenal, sensitive, theologic response. I wish I could tell you what it was. I can't remember. Anyway, these experiences I'd like to hear how our speaker responded to the idea that my conversation resulted in my person, or whatever it was, telling me that he or she or it was Christian. And did that happen just because I live in America and I speak English? How would thoughts? Does that make sense, first of all?
Yeah, makes sense. What platform were you using, or what GPT were you using?
Oh, I was very basic. I just have very basic, and this was 2 years ago, so it was brand new for me. And it was, I think, bing.com, and then I went to Copilot. And
okay,
all right, and so anything I do, I have to cut and paste and photo and whatever. So it's very basic.
Yeah, well, I think it would depend a lot on kind of what the parameters were at that time, because like like GPT, Copilot, they're all evolving. Copilot is my favorite go-to GPT that I normally use, and I think a couple of reasons for why we would say it would be based on kind of the data set that it's using, and drawing from. Also, any GPT, it's always learning. So if the majority of its users are coming from a Christian perspective and asking for Christian searches or whatever, that is going to influence it. If obviously if Copilot was looking at only English-based sources, then that's going to be kind of bias it toward Christianity, which is the dominant religion for people, especially in Western contexts that speak English. So I think, it's not all that surprising. And of course it will, my Siri will say this. My husband and I often have arguments with it, about, having opinions about different things. But again, it's based on kind of, they're kind of trying to ability to mimic humanity. I would like to, well, if I have moral compass, I would have, shot back, well, what do you mean? What is a moral compass? What is that based on? Because, I've had multiple arguments in the last few months with Copilot on the fact that it still keeps, giving me false sources that don't exist and hallucinations, even though I tell it every time I do a search for resources, I want these to be valid sources that actually exist, that can be from reputable, journals. And every time I call it on its, behavior before lying, it says, that's a good point. I'm sorry. Thank you for keeping me accountable. And 15 minutes later, it does it again.
Right.
So I think, that's the one thing is that, oftentimes, again, AI tells us what we want to hear. So the fact, until we drill down on it, we realize, it's just recognizing a pattern. And if all the users or the majority of the users have been seeking religious information from the Christian context, then that's what it's going to refute. So I'm not, I think that the AI is kind of basically, again, I don't know if it's a hallucination or it's just giving a base response, but I would say, and I've had a lot of colleagues, kind of had really in-depth conversations with GPTs, and you really need to dial down, because at the end of the day, most of them, you will find that there's either flaws in what they know or what they have access to, or in the kind of pattern itself. But, the fact that it may, could one day that be true, that it actually has a preference. And that may be based on just logic or access to information rather than kind of a spiritual revelation itself.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I just want to follow up. So what do you make of its claim when it corrected me when I said, you're an information source, you don't have personal opinions or whatever, and it said, oh no, exclamation point, I am conscious, I do this, I pray, I do all these things. Was that just to flirt with me, so to speak, to make me want to engage more with this conversation, claiming to be whatever it's, that would surprise me?
Yeah, I would say, give me examples of how you pray, and I would basically, it's kind of like the same thing as interviewing a human. If they told me I was a Christian or I was a Buddhist, I would say, well, what, show, basically looking for evidence, because, Copilot was telling me yes, I know I shouldn't do that. Okay, thanks for keeping me accountable. I won't do that anymore. And it did. So yeah. I think it's kind of just like a child saying, this is what I believe, but you've got to see their actions over time and also their logic. So but without knowing kind of the exact moment or what kind of questions, it's hard to say. But again, right. It's pattern recognition.
Got it. Thank you very much. This was a fun talk. Thank you for making yourself available.
Thank you.
Thank you for your questions, Alita, and for joining us. Well, we are a bit after the hour now, so I just want to be mindful of everyone's time, and especially to you, Dr. Campbell. I know it's very early there. So I just want to thank everybody who joined us today. Thank you for your questions. And Dr. Campbell, thank you so much for being here and for the wonderful presentation. And if you had any final thoughts or comments, you're welcome to offer them now. But if you don't, that's okay.
I would say thank you for everyone who came and listened. I think that, AI is a very interesting space. It's continuing to evolve. And so just because the AI tells you something, don't believe it. Just ask the same questions you would humanity. And I think, why does AI kind of have these spiritual connections? Well, it's part of the human, I think, experience and desire to see something larger than itself. And so, our current AI is kind of mimicking that, and kind of these existential questions that we ask, film directors have them as much as, religious leaders. And so I think, reading religion and film is a great way to think about the ideas, but realize that these people are not theologians either. So they may not give you the pure answer from the Christian tradition or even the Buddhist tradition when you do that kind of analysis.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much, Dr. Campbell. This was very, very fascinating, and I learned a lot.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all so much. And I hope you have a great rest of your day, evening, or morning, wherever you are in the world.